Today we have DNA expert Ran Sneer with us, who is live at MyHeritage headquarters in Tel Aviv, Israel, for his class, Introducing Genetic Groups. Today's speaker, Ran Sneer. Ran is the Director of Product Management at MyHeritage and is responsible for all MyHeritage DNA products. So we've got the man here with us today. He leads a talented team of developers, QA engineers, and designers to create and optimize DNA users' entire journey, from ordering a DNA kit, tracking the kit's progress, receiving results, to leveraging a continually growing suite of features to make the most of DNA results for our genealogical research. Most recently, he led the development of the chromosome browser for shared DNA segments feature from concept through production and launch. And I guess I'd probably update that to say even more recently, he's worked with the genetic groups that we're going to learn here about today.
Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, good day, good evening, good night. I know we have lots of folks from all around the world, and it's great to be back talking to you and sharing with you the things that we are currently working on, recently released, and about to release or in the works. So today we're going to talk about genetic groups. So let's start. So since we launched MyHeritage DNA product, we gave to our users an ethnicity estimate, which consists up till very recently of 42 ethnicities, from which we were able to tell you what is your ethnical background, what are your roots, where are you from, where are your ancestors from. So the way we built this is that we took what we call a reference population set, sampled people from all around the world who lived and reside and stayed in the same place for a very long periods of time, many generations back, and we were trying to look at their DNA and see what's unique to these people. What can we learn from their genome, and which parts of their DNA we can, for the simplicity, we're going to say color or name it as a specific ethnicity. And we came out with 42 different ethnicities, covering many places around the world, different ethnicities, and that's how we can say that you're X% this and Y% that, and break down your ethnicity estimate to something that sums up to 100. For example, if we have an ethnicity today that's called the Scandinavian, that covers 3 countries, and there are differences between those populations. Unfortunately, when we were trying to work with our models to break down for example, Sweden and Denmark, or Swedish and Danish, to different ethnicities, we couldn't find at that time a good enough indication to say that we can break it down. The genetic looked too similar, so we had to merge those two and end up with an ethnicity we call Scandinavian. So we wanted to give a higher resolution, and that doesn't end when it comes to genetic groups. It doesn't end just with the country level, and we'll get to that. Also, one thing we knew is that our model is not perfect, to be honest. There are many ethnicities that, even though our algorithms were able, and the work that we've done, using the work that we've done, we were able to break it down and determine what is unique for this ethnicity and that ethnicity. In some of the cases, it was just too confusing. And we knew we need to try a different approach. And these are the key values that brought us to work on the genetic groups, on enhancing the ethnicity estimate part of the product that we give our users. So we started the work. To be honest, that work has started pretty much 2.5 years ago, and again involved a lot of people from our science team to the product team, to R&D and design and QA, and we wanted to make sure that the final product that we come out with is in the best shape it could be, and also provide the more accurate results than what we were able to provide so far. So how we did it? Let's take an individual, for example, and I hope at least the most of you on this webinar have taken a DNA test and will be familiar with the terms I'm about to talk about. So the person in the middle, the purple person, has taken a DNA test and he has DNA matches. These are people who have some genetic resemblance to him. They have shared DNA segments. There is something that binds them together. And when we look Next, we look at this person matches, and then his matches, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to build networks. We're trying to see who's connected to who. How can we break down into small groups of people that are all have some genetic resemblance between them? They are all matched to one another, given some thresholds and different settings we put in the algorithm. And we tried taking these groups of DNA matches and clustering them or breaking them down into groups. And this approach works great when you're working on your list of DNA matches, which probably consists of a couple of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of DNA matches. But we wanted to take this approach and try it further. What you see here are billions of matches. Now, think of it, if up till now in the autoclusters we looked at it from the perspective of one person, here is a map that might show us how all of the matches in MyHeritage are connected to one another. We can take millions of kits and billions of matches and see who's connected to who and try and cluster and group them together. The image here is just for reference. It's actually taken from Wikipedia showing connection between servers online, but the concept is very similar. It's just connecting the dots. So every dot here is a person, and then lines going from him to other dots are the other people who he's connected to. Or in other words, these are his DNA matches, and they're connected to one another. And when we ran this algorithm on a big amount of DNA data files, we were able to come up with clusters. This is just a tiny portion of what it actually, there's no real way of showing how this map really looks like, this whole happening behind the scenes, but the algorithm actually outputs clusters. It tells you, here's a group of people who are all matching one another, and there's something probably that's connecting them or that's unique to them. So the algorithm outputs these clusters. We took 1.7 million MyHeritage users, 1.7 million kits that we had in the database at that point of time, for which they had 10.6 billion DNA matches, and we ran this algorithm, and the output was thousands of clusters. So if I'm coming back for a second to this image, so imagine a map showing thousands of these groups, thousands of these clusters of people connected to one another. Now, if you can see, there are still links outside. It's not that they're standing alone or isolated from the rest of the net, but you can still identify them if you look at the map and see that there's something that's unique here, something worth looking at. By the way, there are many more here. I circled just some of them, highlighted some of them. So we ended up with thousands of clusters. And then we said, okay, let's look at these people. Let's see what's in common for each one of these groups. So we took a cluster and we looked at the family trees of the people with the DNA data that we had. So there's a lot of valuable data there that we can look at and see what picture can we draw from all this information aggregated together. There's nothing here that we're looking personally, for example. We're not looking at specific people or looking for specific individuals, but we're trying to look for commonalities in the data within that group. We looked at birth facts, we looked at death facts, places where these events took place, different times, and we tried, and looking at all this data anonymously, of course, in high level, trying to come up with something that will be a little bit more interesting. What can we tell? What is the story that we can tell here? Is there something that's hiding behind this? So we looked at the ancestral events, the birth and death facts. We looked at common surnames, which in some of the cases can hint to a specific population or a specific group of people. Migration events, we looked whether people moved from one place to another. We can see that when the generations go by, or sometimes if the person was born in one place but died in another, maybe they moved, and if the numbers are high enough and appear in enough trees, that might lead to a migration event for that group, a group of people who have moved from one place to another in a certain point of time. Ethnicities in a group is something that sometimes played a big role. So if we had two groups, for example, that were distinct, there were no connections between those groups, but when we looked at the data, we saw that these people lived in the same place during the same time, but we see that they're not connected genetically. And that's because these are people from different ethnicities living in the same area. So that's also playing a role, also important to look at. And we looked for overlapping, whether there are geographical overlaps and also overlaps between different groups. Here are some examples of what the algorithm output. So I spoke about the differences between the ethnicities and the genetic groups. So today, out of our 42 ethnicities, we have one ethnic group that's called Finnish. We have one ethnicity which is Finnish, but we looked at one of the groups that came out, ID 396, irrelevant at this point. We see that the majority of them are Finnish in ethnicity, but when we look at the historical events where the birth and death facts took place, we can see that it's pointing to a specific location in Finland. So now we can tell about this group, that people of this group, when we looked at their ancestors in their trees, we saw that it's pointing to that region. So I can tell these people now, not only that you're Finnish, you also have ancestral roots in District 12, for example, in Finland, which is great. Here's another example of 3 different groups that came out. We have an ethnicity on MyHeritage that's called North and Western European. And that's a great ethnicity, but it covers a huge geographical area in Europe. And we weren't able, for example, to tell you whether you're from Austria or Germany or France. But with genetic groups, when we ran this algorithm, we saw that we ended up with 3 different groups. And looking at the ancestral events, surnames, ethnicities in some cases, we can differentiate between them. We can separate them and say that these are different groups. And we can now tell something new to our users, not only that you're from North, not only that your ancestors are from North and West Europe, they are from this specific area in Austria, for example. So that's the work we did. And again, years of work. The algorithms can help us to a certain point of aggregating the data. But a lot of it, if not all of it, was manually reviewed by us to make sure that there are not too many noises coming from the trees, that the data is accurate. And most of this manual review was done by our awesome Senior Vice President of Product Management, Uri Gonen. And after working with all of the initial thousands of groups that came out from the algorithm, we ended up with 2,114 unique geographic regions or genetic groups that can tell a different story. Each one of them has something unique in it, something that differentiates them from the others. And I think that we are now ready to actually look at how this looks on MyHeritage. I'm looking at a Jane Smith account. That's a personal account, but the results are real. I just changed the name. So you can access this by logging into your MyHeritage account. From the DNA navigation bar, you can choose ethnicity estimated, look at your genetic groups. I'm currently in the overview tab, which is showing an overview of your results, including matches. And here we can see a glimpse of the ethnicity estimates and also an indication of how many genetic groups this user has. And if I'll go to the ethnicity estimate, you'll be greeted with a nice pop-up telling you that we've introduced genetic groups. So what can we see here? So we're looking at Jane's ethnicity estimate results, which include both her percentage-based ethnicities, but also her genetic groups. One thing that some of you may notice is this genetic group's confidence level. Genetic groups, unlike the ethnicities, don't come with percentages, but they do come with a confidence level. When we were able to create, when our algorithm was able to create those 2,114 groups, we created special genetic characteristics for these groups so that when we look at your DNA data, we can tell you which genetic groups we think you're a member of, you are related to. And in some of the cases, we see a very strong relationship. We see a lot of genetic indications that you're related to the genetic groups, and sometimes we see less. So here the default is set to medium, and we have 7 out of 15 genetic groups for these users. Let's look at the results. So she has 39% Iberian, and under that we can see that we have 4 different groups in Portugal. Now remember I said that sometimes we can narrow it down to a country level, and sometimes we can say even more about a region, like the Finnish example we looked at, and that's also the case here in Portugal. So we were able here to identify 4 different groups in Portugal. Up till now, Jane knew that she's Iberian, and the Iberian Peninsula consists of both Spain and Portugal. So we couldn't differentiate that. But here we see strong indications for Portugal, and we're mentioning that. What else do we show you? We give you common surnames. In some cases, as genealogists, you probably all know, surnames are very valuable and gives us a lot of hints and indications to things we want to look at. So these are surnames we were able to gather when we looked at this family tree, and we can see Rodriguez, Ferreira, Fernandez, Gomez, etc. That have all, these are the surnames that were most popular in the family trees forming this group. And you can hover to see how many times each one of them appeared in a family tree. We will indicate in how many of the trees this surname came up. We are also giving common given names, which is fun facts, and sometimes interesting to see that there are also more common names than others when it comes to given names. And what are the common ethnicities for this group? So in some of the cases, especially when we're talking about settlers and other groups, you will see that there are many ethnicities forming this group, but in this case, people from the Iberian Peninsula, it was very dominant. The Iberian ethnicity was the most dominant one. I'll jump for a second to my own personal results. So I'm Ashkenazi Jewish, and let's look at the group that I got, which is Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Romania, which my ancestors are from there. And if you look at the screen now, you'll see a nice timeline component at the bottom of the screen. Functionality-wise, it lets you switch the time period. So you can click on a time period, and you can see where these people lived at that point of time and how they moved from one place to another. You can look at it you can look at it one by one. You can jump from one point of time to another. But something really nice, I think, that we've implemented is the option to play the timeline animation. So in my story right here, I'm going to start. I hope it'll go fluent enough or smooth enough through the webinar. But when I'm clicking on the play animation, you can see that the bar runs. I'm not touching anything on my screen right now. And I'm looking at how this genetic group, the story that it tells me throughout time, since the beginning, since 1600 till these days, and where Ashkenazi Jews have lived around the world in different periods of time. In some of the cases, especially when there are migrations, it's really nice to look at the story in this sense and using the animation. And also when the group lived in the same area, plus in the same area throughout many decades, you can see how the population even slightly moved, or more people moved from different villages or different districts to another, even in that same area. And the timeline animation lets you see that. So with that, I think I will conclude. I thank you all very, very much. We're very proud of this feature. We hope this brings light and joy and help you with your research. That's our end goal, and everything we do is trying to achieve that goal.